Welcome to the NHL Wraparound podcast featuring Neil Smith, President General Manager of the 1994 Stanley Cup champion New York Rangers, and longtime ESPN NHL veteran Vic Morren. Together, they share no-nonsense opinions on news and issues around the National Hockey League. Whether you're a casual or diehard fan, each episode of NHL Wraparound will leave you more informed. Now, here's your hosts, Neil and Vic.
Welcome to NHL Wraparound. It is Martin Luther King Day, January 20th, 2025. Vic Morren along with Neil Smith. And, you know, Neil, when we were on short shifts on Friday, I actually promoted this show as being President's Day. So for somebody that really prides himself on being boned up on history, I am truly holiday challenged.
Yeah, this is the celebration of Dr. King's birthday, which is actually on the 15th of January, but it's celebrated on the following Monday, which is today. But I added to your President's Day, too, by saying that our guest, who's a Canadian, Gord Miller, might change the name to Prime Minister's Day. So I was no better than you.
One thing that will be better, 3 things you need to pay attention to, brought to you by UBS Financial Services, Inc. So a lot to go through here with the expectation sometime Monday that Connor McDavid will be suspended for a cross-check at the end of the Edmonton-Vancouver game Saturday against Connor Garland. But who's really at fault here? Because there's been a lot of talk in Edmonton that, the league should be happy now that McDavid snapped. But of course, he probably got away with a suspension for that little elbow that he threw last week at Marcus Johansson that has him on the sidelines.
Yeah, perhaps. And, you know, my words to this, and I know that Connor McDavid is today our Mario Lemieux, our Wayne Gretzky, our Bobby Orr, our Gordie Howe, whatever era you want to take the best player, he's that today. But all those guys went through crap too. They all took crap because when you're playing against the best player, you're not as good as him. And so you have to do whatever you have to do to keep him from scoring, to keep him from dominating the game, to keep him from beating your team. And a lot of times there'll be illegal things that are done to these superstars. You remember how many times Mario complained about garage hockey, and Wayne had an enforcer beside him, and Bobby Orr literally had to fight. I mean, in his era, and Gordie Howe fought many times. So you know what? It goes along with the territory, and you're paid a ton of money, and you're the best player, and you're, for the rest of your life, you're going to be rich and famous. This just goes with it.
What's also interesting is referees Wes McCauley and Chris Lee are coming under a lot of scrutiny for not calling a penalty there. But truth is that the engagement between McDavid and Garland took place with 19 seconds left in regulation. It lasted about 13 seconds. I think the Garland knockdown was legal. I think holding McDavid down twice wasn't. But Edmonton maintained possession, and they were playing 5-on-4 at that point, and they actually got a couple of good looks. So the fault being blamed on the referees, to me, doesn't work.
No, not to me either. And, you know, they're the easy guys to always pick on, the referees. And I just think it's unfortunate, but every player is responsible for keeping control of their emotions in a game. And if you don't, which a lot don't, and maybe 100% of the players at some point don't control their emotions in their career. But when you don't, that's why you have player safety there, and they got to do what they got to do.
There will also be a secondary suspension likely coming down to Tyler Myers for cross-checking Evan Bouchard of the Oilers in a similar fashion off to the side as part of all of the chaos that was going on at the end of that game on Saturday. Number 2, flavor of the week in the East wild card. Last week it was Detroit. They have now proceeded to lose 3 out of 4. This week, the Ottawa Senators, Neil.
Yeah, they are playing really well. And you know what? I'll save my comments for Gord Miller for when he comes on. And let's talk to Gord, who does a lot of Ottawa games as a play-by-play guy for TSN. Let's find out the inside scoop on the Ottawa Senators.
5-0-1 since their team meeting after their loss to Buffalo following their long 9-game road trip. Number 3. The New Jersey Devils are struggling 2-5-3 in their last 10. They've been shut out 6 times. They've scored 1 goal or fewer in 10 of their 48 games. So for a team that has one of the more dynamic offenses in the NHL, this one's a bit perplexing.
It really is. And hopefully for Sheldon Keefe and the New Jersey Devils, it's just a bit of a slump that they're going through during the season here. And I would think that's what it is because they have the same great players playing there and they have outstanding goaltending in Markstrom this year. So, but it's perplexing when you're on the outside and you're watching and you're going, how come those same guys can't score? They scored all the time and they can't score this time, but the Devils are in a scoring slump.
And we will do a deeper dive on New York centric about the Devils' struggles tomorrow. This has been 3 Things You Need to Pay Attention To, brought to you by UBS Financial Services, Inc.
Well, now it is my distinct pleasure to bring on to NHL Wraparound an old friend. And when I say old, I don't mean age-wise. I mean years of friendship. Gord Miller. The truth be known, Gord, if it weren't for you, I never would have had the opportunities I had in TV because you got me started when I first left the Rangers and going on a show with you. And I'm forever grateful for that. And we've had a great friendship ever since.
It's my pleasure. So I'm responsible for unleashing you on the unsuspecting populace?
Yes. Not only on the men. So let's get right at it because Gord, you are, we're so happy, Vic and I, to get you on the show because you, if anybody knows the Canadian teams, it's Gord Miller. And we don't get to talk to a lot of people that are experts on the Canadian teams because obviously we're based in the States. But the buzz in Canada with 4 overachieving teams, Montreal, Ottawa, Calgary, and Winnipeg, and 2 playing pretty much as expected, I would think, in Edmonton and Toronto. And then you've got Vancouver laying out there underachieving for what was expected of them. But it is quite a thing to have all the teams in Canada in the mix and none of them not being ignored. Like most years, there is a number of Canadian teams that aren't even in it.
That's true. And, you think about a team like Ottawa. I mean, they've been out of it quite often in November. Like by American Thanksgiving, they've been out. And that's not the case. Montreal's a lot better. I think the most compelling story in Canada is Vancouver. And maybe one of the most compelling stories in the NHL because it's such a public soap opera. And Neil, you know this, that there's lots of conflict in dressing rooms. It happens all the time. These are, highly motivated, competitive people. There's going to be clashes. But what's unfolded in Vancouver has become so public. It's public knowledge about JT Miller and Elias Pettersson. It's public that they don't get along. It's been reported about the spats they've had and the disputes they've had. And now you had the situation where, on Saturday, there were reports that Miller was going to be pulled from the lineup and moved maybe back to the Rangers where he started. And it's just incredible to me that this has been such a public soap opera. And yet here's the Canucks, right on the verge of a playoff spot. They're a good, they're a decent team. And the funny thing is, if they make the playoffs, they could do some damage. They got Thatcher Demko, they got Quinn Hughes. Some of their guys are starting to turn it around. But I don't know how much longer this is sustainable. I really don't think this can go on much longer.
Gord, you noted Miller and him possibly being scratched. Then he goes out, 2 assists, 18-5 in the faceoff dots. He plays head-to-head with McDavid and is spectacular. So, to your point, is this sustainable? Can this team move forward without making a move?
Well, This is not a recent development. These two have not gotten along for quite a long time. It's been an open secret for years that they're not on the same page. They're two very different people. And, it's not like one or the other is to blame. They're just different people. And Miller's a very, high energy, intense guy, and Pettersson's not. And there's the famous story that my colleague Farhan Lalji reported from Vancouver where, during practice, Miller grabbed Pettersson by the collar and said, "Stop being such a baby." So you ask if it's sustainable. I mean, it's gone on this long. They had a pretty good run last year when they were feuding, but now that it's public and they have to talk about it all the time. And I think, to be honest, Vic, they handled it poorly because when it became public, you had, the general manager, the coach, the captain all talked about it, that they had to sort of, sort it out. And then Miller and Pettersson came out and said, well, there's nothing going on. It's all fabrication. Well, it's not. Your teammates are talking about it. The coach is talking about it. So it was kind of 101 on how not to deal with a crisis. And so I think look, JT Miller's a really good player. Like you can say what you want. Like he probably rubs a lot of people the wrong way. Look, I mean, the Canucks, he's been in New York, he's been in Tampa, he's been in Vancouver. He rubs some people the wrong way, but he also helps your team win. I think it's a very hard trade to make because he would be an enormous loss for the Canucks. You talked about his performance against Edmonton on Saturday. That looked like a playoff game, and he looked like a top playoff player.
And before we move on to other clubs in Canada, I wanted to talk about the game Saturday night against the Edmonton Oilers. And Vancouver had great regular season success against Edmonton last year, took them to 7 games in the second round last year. And for a club that was struggling, that was the kind of game that they needed. And perhaps, is this a game that bonds them, or is it just simply an outlier? Because you had the McDavid incident with Connor Garland at the end of the game. You had Tyler Myers and Evan Bouchard. So that's the type of game that could conceivably bond the club.
Yeah, and I think, Neil made the point at the start of the broadcast about, how the Canucks are underachieving. And it's true, they are. It's all about expectations, right? Like, Montreal's having a great year. Vancouver's having a bad year. Well, they're both in 9th place in their respective conferences. It's all about expectations. And so there are much higher expectations for Vancouver than there are. I mean, if you were ranking the Canadian teams in terms of, preseason expectations, I would say, probably Toronto 1, Vancouver 2, Edmonton 2, Vancouver maybe 3. They were that high up the list. And so I think that, yes, it's a disappointing season for them. They're underperforming, but they can still get in. Like, they're still a good team. And as I said earlier, if they get in, they can do some damage.
Gord, one last thing about the Canucks, if you could explain this to me and to everybody else. So, last season was a shocker to me. I'll just use me as the guinea pig idiot here. Vancouver was a shocker. They started off with that big win against Edmonton, which started Edmonton's bad start to the season. And the Canucks never looked back. They went on and did all these fabulous things. Quinn Hughes wins the Norris. Tocchet wins the Jack Adams. And then coming into this year, everybody's like, well, they're as you just said, they're at least the number 3 story in Canada, like behind them. I'm going to mention that Rick Tocchet's coaching history has sort of been this way a little bit, where he started off as a player's guy and really got some good success, and then it hasn't carried over. I'm not blaming him. I just wanted you to say what went right last year and what's gone so wrong this year, other than what we've just spoken about with the in-house fighting and all that stuff. I mean, it's hard from my vantage point to pick out, why are the Canucks last year so different than they were the year before, and now this year so different than they were last year?
Well, Brock Besser had 40 goals last year. This year he's got 15 at the halfway mark of the season. Elias Pettersson has 10 goals. Ultimately they're not scoring. And maybe last year they overachieved in terms of the way they scored goals, but they're not scoring at nearly the rate. They're not winning games the way they won them last year, and they're finding it hard to win low scoring games. That's not really the way they're built. As for Tocchet, I would extend it. I don't know that it's particularly his DNA, but it's the DNA of a lot of coaches. And I think to Sheldon Keefe in Toronto, after Mike Babcock, he was kind of the player's coach, right? He gave more ice time to Matthews, more ice time to Marner and Nylander, and kind of, took the shackles off them and let them play. And then after a couple of years, guess what? He started cracking down. You're not there to be the player's friend. You're not there to be their buddy and make them feel good about themselves. You're there to put them in the best position you can for them to win. And I saw, on Saturday, Boston played Ottawa in a game. Ottawa tied the game late to go to overtime. And Joe Sacco, the coach of the Bruins, benched Brad Marchand in overtime. He's one of the most productive overtime players in the history of the format. So, the coach's job is not to, put his arm around you, sing kumbaya and tell you everything's going to be great. Sometimes his job is to kick your butt. And it's all well and good to start out. It's all sunshine and roses when you start, and it's a fresh voice and everyone's happy. But when the hard times come, sometimes you got to be hard. And that's the difficult part of it.
Let's move east a little bit to Edmonton, and Oilers, Saturday night notwithstanding, still remain one of the hottest clubs in the NHL. They just signed John Klingberg to a one-year contract, and there's a few other pieces that may come back at some point, Evander Kane being one of them. Do you believe that this club right now, as it's comprised, has what it takes to take that final step come the spring?
I think they do. I think the problem is there's 10 or 11 other teams in the exact same position. And I think 7 of them play in the West. I think they're one of the 7 teams in the West that could win the Stanley Cup, and it would not be a surprise. Right? Winnipeg, Dallas, Minnesota are all having great years. Vegas, LA, Colorado. There's championship DNA there in some of those teams. There's star players. There is just, Winnipeg has the best goalie in the world right now. I don't think there's any question that Connor Hellebuck is the best goaltender on the planet. He won the Vezina last year, and the way he's going, he's going to win it again this year. So yes, I do think they are, but I think they're in a very crowded field, and getting out of the West is going to be very, very difficult this year. But they have, look, there's 32 teams now. So it's very hard to have difference makers, but Edmonton has 2 of them. They have 2. I did a game the other night. I did Toronto, New Jersey last Thursday night, and the Leafs were not very good in that game. But Auston Matthews and William Nylander took it over and won them the game. They both scored twice. They're star players, and they won them the game. The Oilers the other night played in Colorado, and they weren't very good. But Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl willed them to a win, or skilled them to win, if you want to call it that. When you have those 2 guys, very few other teams have that. And so, if you just look at it statistically, like on the odds, if you go into the game and you have the 2 best players in that game that night, your chances of winning are pretty good.
That said, where do you see the Oilers being most vulnerable?
In goal. I think that's the big question they have, and they're not the only ones. And it's funny, when you think back on some recent Stanley Cup winning goaltenders, take out Vasilevsky in Tampa because he's a superstar, no question. Bobrovsky last year in Florida, he has been a superstar, but he lost the net the year before. But there's a whole bunch of anti-Niemis and, Jordan Binnington was in the American League halfway through that year. Braden Holtby didn't start the playoffs for Washington the year they won. Matt Murray won a couple of cups. I think the question for Edmonton would be, can the goaltending stand up for 4 rounds? Can that, if it's Skinner and Pickard or Skinner and whoever, can they stand up for 4 rounds? They came close last year. They came really close last year. And so, but that would be the biggest question for me.
And Gord, you move south in Alberta down to Calgary, Alberta, and the Flames are another, to me, are a surprising team this year. I thought that they were going to be rebuilding, and I thought they were going to be well out of it, and I thought they were positioned to do all that. Great start to the season, and now all I think about when I think about the Calgary Flames is that goaltender, and he's just been amazing.
Like, it's incredible to me that the Rookie of the Year talk all year has been Macklin Celebrini, absolutely. Having a great year for San Jose, 100%. Lane Hudson, Montreal, absolutely. Great year. Matvei Michkov, he's tailed off a bit lately, but he's been great. Dustin Wolf is the only reason, Neil, you just said it. He's the only reason they're in contention. He's got the 6th best save percentage in the league. Like, never mind rookies, in the league. Like, he's been unbelievable. And for me, he should be at least a co-favorite for the Rookie of the Year. They're getting better play out of Huberdeau. He's having a better year. Nazem Kadri has turned into this elder statesman kind of, character leader in Calgary, which is great. They get scoring by committee. Mackenzie Weegar is still a really underrated guy. Rasmus Anderson, who's going to be an unrestricted free agent at the end of the year. He's another guy that is really underrated because he plays in Calgary. But bottom line is, Wolf has been the whole thing. I mean, it's just, if he was doing this in New York or Chicago or LA or, any Washington or Pittsburgh, it would be like one of the biggest stories in the league. And it's criminal that he's not getting more recognition for this. I looked at the Rookie of the Year odds the other day, and he was like plus 2,200 or something. I think it's come down now, but like, he should be right there in that mix.
I agree with you totally. And you just said if he was in New York, well, if he was in New York, his name would be Shesterkin because that's sort of what he got. But I got last question from me about Calgary is, having said all that we just said, and I think you're bang on with everything, can they make the playoffs when they can't win on the road?
Well, that's going to be the test for them, right? They really struggle on the road. Look, they're right there right now. They've played on the road, so far, and they're still in the mix. They've got to get better on the road if they're going to do that. And their schedule gets tougher, but they've played the good teams in the West pretty tough. Like, they've been tough against the good teams in the West. So I think they can. Now, can Wolf sustain a full year? I mean, he's going to play 65 games. He's been fine so far. Like, and his temperament, I mean, if you've ever talked to him, I don't think a lot bothers him, if anything. So, no, I think they can. I do think, though, the grind late in the year, I would ask this, like, who's behind them? Right now, they're in the 8th spot. So it's kind of down to Vancouver and them right now. St. Louis is kind of on the periphery of that. But can they hold their own against them? Sure. Why not? They're here now. So why not?
Well, and last thing is, Wolf might be what you just said earlier is Calgary's difference maker. You go into a hockey game and you have a goaltender that's that good. He won goaltender of the year twice in the American League, 2 years in a row. You take a guy like that goes in. I mean, Shesterkin, and we can go back, Dominic Hasek, you can go back to all kinds of guys. Marty Brodeur that were so good that was their difference maker, that you got outplayed. I remember one night we were in Vancouver, the Rangers with Mike Richter. I think they had 60 shots and we ended up with a tie. Somehow we came out with a tie. So Wolf could be that guy that puts him in the playoffs.
So Neil, we talked about the Calder Trophy for the Rookie of the Year. I think he might get some Vezina consideration. Like, he should seriously be considered as one of the top 3 or 4 goaltenders in the league this year. He's having that kind of year.
I can tell you from having been a voter for the Vezina for years that how the GMs do it. And it's real simple. You just take the stats and you look at the stats, and whoever deserves it based on the stats, that's who you usually vote for, because that's the stats are everything, right? With the Vezina, that's what wins the Vezina.
I would frame it this way. Who's the one goaltender you wouldn't trade for any other goaltender? And once you take him out of the equation, so say that's Hellebuck. Take him out of the equation. Who's the next goaltender you wouldn't trade based solely on this year? Like, it's not their history, it's not their career, but just based on this year alone. And he's, I don't say he's the winner, but he's in that mix for sure.
And because of his future as well, the future that he's got. You know, you've got a long future. Anyway, Vic, sorry, took too long on that one.
No, it's hey, Dustin Wolf has earned it. Before we move over to Winnipeg, Gord, I just want to ask you about Ryan Huska and how he's evolved as a coach this season, and that he's got buy-in from his club. So just how do you see the job that he's done behind the bench?
Well, I think he's done an amazing job, because last year was a very, very difficult year in Calgary. And, you know, we saw the whole soap opera at the deadline with Jacob Markstrom, who clearly was ready to leave, and then the deal didn't happen. And he was not private about his feelings. He was very public about how he was disappointed. And that team looked like it was unspooling. And then, you know, they do make the Markstrom deal, and it kind of looks like they don't want to say rebuild, because no one does now, but it kind of looked like they were in a rebuild. Huska's a very good coach. He's been around a long time, you know, and I think, you know, he coached their minor league team. He had a lot of those guys there. And I think he gets a lot out of players. And I think, you know, in today's NHL, you're going to have guys on your roster that you don't really want. They're either too young, they're too old, or whatever. But just because of the salary cap, you're going to have some players you don't want. To me, the secret to being a good coach is getting the most out of those guys. Like, they're there. And I always think about, you know, a GM I like a lot said to his head coach, who was complaining about how some of the players were no good. He said, well, the sign on your door says coach. Try that. You know, and I think that that's what Ryan Huska does, is he coaches these guys to be the best player they can be, whatever that is. Whether it's a star player, a role player, a kid, a veteran, he gets a lot out of them.
Guy that inherited a pretty good roster was Scott Arniel in Winnipeg. And Jets had a really good regular season a year ago, and then everything went to pot really after game 1 against Colorado. Are they deep enough, in your opinion? Because that team also, which I don't think a lot of fans know, Kyle Connor, Mark Scheifele, Nikolai Ehlers. But do you see this club having enough depth? They're number 1 in the West as of this morning. Can they sustain that? And even more importantly, once they get to the playoffs, can they play with the heavyweights, with the Edmontons, with the Colorados?
Well, I think one of the most shocking things in last year's Stanley Cup playoffs was how the Jets, as a group, and Hellebuck as an individual, really underperformed. Like, Hellebuck had a really, really tough playoff. And I think they can. I think if you look back at the history of great players, you'll find times when they did not do well in the playoffs. I think they have the depth to do it. And I think what's interesting about their defense is, again, you're talking about underrated players, partly because of the markets they play in. But Josh Morrissey is a really underrated player. I think for the Jets, you know, they got the buy-in last year when Hellebuck and Scheifele re-signed there, which I think shocked a lot of people, right? I think that stunned a lot of people. Those two guys both elected to stay there. They got that buy-in. Now the problem you've got is that other key players are pending unrestricted free agents. The window is always going to be tight in Winnipeg. So Ehlers is unrestricted. You know, Pionk's contract is up. So I think they can. But again, like we said about Edmonton, it's a very crowded field in the West. They're a very good team, but there's a lot of other ones. And so they'll need Hellebuck to be, you know, the Hellebuck that guided them to the conference final a few years ago. And they'll need, but they have the depth of scoring. Like, Kyle Connor is one of the best pure goal scorers in the NHL. He's consistent. He's really good. And I think they can, but again, it's going to be a really tough climb out of the West. Like, it's from the opening round on, you're not going to get easy matchups in the West. It's going to be really hard. I mean, right now, Colorado's the first wildcard team. Like, a division champion would play Colorado in the first round of the playoffs.
Yeah. Having said that, the playoff format, Gord, is a sore spot to a lot of people when it gets down to playoff time. And we all then start to realize that, and I don't mean us being guys that follow it all the time, but the fans, they realize, oh my God, I've gone 6 months and my team might be gone in a week.
Well, right. And think about, like, right now, I'm looking at it right now. Right now, the playoff matchups in the West would be Winnipeg versus Calgary, Dallas, Minnesota, Edmonton, LA, Vegas, Colorado. So right away, one of Vegas or Colorado would be out in the first round of the playoffs. Right. And people complain about the format all the time, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes into that. The NHL wants regional rivalries. So they do want, this to build up. You're not going to face a bad team in the playoffs anyway. 1 to 8, partially divisional, whatever it is, you're not going to get a bad team. So, I mean, if you're hoping to play Chicago in the first round of the playoffs, that's not going to happen.
A couple of clubs that have had sustained dry spells, Canadiens and Senators, sitting on the cusp right now. Ottawa, by virtue of their 2 wins over the weekend, are the first wild card. Montreal in third after their win against the Rangers on Sunday. They're 12-3-1 in their last 16. It is. And I watched Jakub Dobeš, now 5-0, wasn't as good Sunday evening as he was in his previous 4, but I'm just getting flashbacks of Patrik Laine and Andrew Hammond in Ottawa with this great start that he's having.
It's amazing. They are, it's not known for being a patient market, but they've been very patient with this rebuild. And you're starting to see, for lack of a better analogy, you're starting to see green shoots coming up through the ground. You start to see grass coming up through the ground, right? I thought they made a huge mistake keeping Slavkovsky up as an 18-year-old. He had not dominated at any level to that point. I think that was a mistake. And he has, he scored last night, but he's got, 6 goals on the year. But Hudson has been an unbelievable second-round pick. Like, Lane Hudson's probably, if you're redoing that draft, he's top 3 probably now in that draft. He's been amazing. And he's another guy, and Neil, you can speak to this because you know how this works from scouting and managing, is sometimes people want to take a player and just put him in a box and say, this is what he is. And that was Quinn Hughes in his first year. The knock on him was that he wasn't very good defensively. And he wasn't early on, but he got better as the year went along. I talked to some analytics people about Lane Hudson. His first 20 games, he was bottom 10 in the league in, zone entry denied, puck battles won, passes broken up, things like that. But the second quarter, he's been way better. All he has to be for me is average defensively. If he can just be average defensively, then you've got a star on your hands because he is top 5 in all the offensive analytics. Passing to the slot, zone entries, zone exits, all those things. He is that good. So I think there's a lot of excitement in Montreal. Dobeš is a big part of that too. Now I think, Kent Hughes is carefully trying to say, like, settle down, everyone. Like, we're not going to go out and trade for a veteran. We're not trading a first round pick for a veteran to try to make the playoffs here. This is a process. But I do think, getting Carey from Nashville has slotted their defense pairings better. So he's playing with Caden Gooley, and now Hudson's playing with a veteran, right, in Mike Matheson. And so that sorts their pairings out better. So I think that's really helped for Montreal. And look, I think that the NHL is a better league when Montreal's good. And that game last night against the Rangers, I mean, the Rangers will hate it. I mean, they led 4 times. But that was a game. And think back, Vic, a month ago, Montreal I think they just lost like 9-2 on home ice to Pittsburgh. Got booed off the ice. Like, it looked, they were getting drilled at home a lot. And it didn't look good. And then they've gone on this run. And all of a sudden, there's excitement and you can see it in the players. But they're coming around. It's a long way to go to be, these rebuilds take a long time and sometimes they don't work out. Like sometimes you tear it down and it doesn't build back up. But there are signs there that they've got the pieces that you would need to be a contender going forward.
This is probably like the way Philly was about a year ago.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, remember exactly, like Philly was right on the cusp last year. They fell apart down the stretch, right? I mean, Philadelphia they cratered down the stretch. Yeah, I think maybe the difference would be that, you know, in a guy like Caulfield, Montreal's probably got more high-end scoring. The question for them will be which one of these defensemen kind of shakes out which one of these young defensemen stakes out as the true number one. And it might be Goalie, it might be Hudson, could be both. But you're just looking for signs of encouraging, of an encouraging future, right? That's what you want. And that's what's happening there.
I got one comment on the Canadiens and then a question, Gord. The comment is, I love Lane Hudson. I watched him carefully. He reminds me of Cale Makar. Honestly, that's when I watch him play, he's got the poise. Now, he's not as good as him yet, obviously, but he reminds me of the way that Cale Makar plays the game. And that's just my comment on that. But I do want to get to another question that we haven't touched on here, and it's a spicy one, is our friend Patrik Laine being there, who when they did the move, I said, like, what the hell are they doing? Why would they want to bring him into a rebuild? This is a guy who just wants to stand on one spot and shoot, and he doesn't want to do anything else. I still think that's all he wants to do, and that's all he does do. So what do you think?
Well, I think the guy who's about to become the NHL's all-time leading goal scorer does that too. It's been a tidy living for him. Yeah, you know, Laine is an interesting guy because I think he rubbed a lot of people the wrong way in Winnipeg. I think he rubbed some people the wrong way in Columbus. He's a defiant character who's full of confidence a lot of the times. And he sometimes says things that kind of make you, like when he went into Columbus and basically said they're used to losing and they don't mind it there. I mean, you know, that certainly made the Blue Jackets a little chippy.
That might have been the best thing he ever did for Columbus.
It might have been, yeah, when you think about it. So look, he's a high-end goal scorer who's fit right in there. Will he long term? Hard to know. You know, he's worn his welcome to other markets, but he is a very talented goal scorer. We saw it last night with the overtime winner. So, you know, coaches get obsessed with 200-foot players. They want a guy who plays the right way, plays 200-foot game. Sometimes 60-foot players are good too. You know, you got Alexei Kovalev, Neil in New York. Like, you know, Alex, I'm sure Alex could pick Mike Richter out of a police lineup, but you know, he could really play. And I think that, you know, Laine, so again, we go back to what we talked about earlier, expectation, right? So in Montreal, there was so low expectations even a month ago, so that he's riding this wave of this young team. He's producing. So that's the big thing, right? Because when goal scorers aren't scoring, they can be miserable people to be around. And he's scoring goals. The team is winning. There's enthusiasm in the market. He likes it there. So ride the wave.
Ottawa. So question for you, Gord. Did you have Zach Stepchuk and Artem Zub on your anytime goal parlay yesterday for their game in Jersey?
If I did, I would be scouting for beachfront property in the Bahamas right now, because that would pay a zillion to one. That was something else. I mean, you know, you look at schedule losses, and that looked like one for Ottawa. They played Boston in the afternoon on Saturday, late afternoon. Emotional game, 6-5 shootout win. Fly to Jersey, get to the rooms at 11 o'clock, 1 o'clock afternoon game. Now, the Devils played in the afternoon too, but they played at home the day before. So you just kind of look at it and say, you know, they got Anton Forsberg in goal, who was winless in his last 5 starts. He'd been shelled the last time out. It just looked like a schedule loss. They got outshot 16-2 in the first period, and Forsberg was unbelievable. And then, as you said, Ostapchuk, who hadn't scored in 39 career games, wheels around, puts one in. And Artem Zub, who hadn't scored on a goaltender this year, he had an empty netter last Tuesday. He hadn't scored in the first 3 months of the season. Now he's got 2 in like the last 8 days. So no, I did not have that. They are a resilient group. I think what has happened there is they've been through so much losing and so much disappointment that they were receptive to Travis Green's message. That Travis Green came in with a message of accountability and discipline and, doing things the right way. And I think that it's landing with those guys because they've been miserable for so long. And you're probably thinking there has to be a better way. Like we can't keep doing things the way we're doing them because that doesn't work.
What does it tell you about this club that before they went on that monstrous 9-game road trip, which was before and after the World Juniors, which of course you covered, we want to get that in as well, they had kind of established somewhat of an identity. They went 4-4-1 on the trip, come home, lose 4-0 game to Buffalo, have a team meeting. Right. Team meeting right after. And now they are 5-0-1 in their last 6. And that identity that they had created before that road trip appears to have returned.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it underlines that you shouldn't overreact to small segments of the season, right? It's a long year. There's going to be ups and downs for everyone, but the key is don't let a bad game become a bad week, become a bad month. And that's what's happened in Ottawa in past years, right? And usually in October and November, a bad couple of games turned into a bad week. And then all of a sudden it got away from them. They're interesting because Tim Stützle is a star player. He is a star player. No question about it. He's a great, they got those 2 guys in 2020. They got Stützle 3rd overall and Jake Sanderson 5th overall. They're probably the 2 best players out of that draft. Brady Tkachuk is an absolute unicorn of a player. There is no one else like him. I can't think of another player like him in the NHL who does what he does. The way that he does it. He's a bull in a china shop. He's not great defensively all the time, but he is always in the middle of the action. Like there are very few Brady Tkachuk shifts that you don't notice him. It's amazing. And he's going to score 35 goals again this year. He's going to drive goalies nuts. I don't know if you saw it yesterday. Did you see the penalty he waved off? So a high stick, and he kind of shot his head back. And, the stick was near his face. So you kind of react that way. And the referee shot his arm up, and he went, no. The officials conferred and said no penalty. And he's on the bench going, yeah, that's right. Good call.
Didn't McCarr do that a year ago? Where he denied a penalty and said, no, it wasn't a foul.
I think so. He's always like, look, he grew up his dad, he grew up around NHL players. He's got that in him. Like, I'm not saying I'm not saying Brady Tkachuk is a model citizen on the ice. He's not. And that's part of his appeal. He is a train wreck on the ice. Like you never know what's going to happen next. And that's part of why you like him. He keeps everyone on their toes. And so, yeah, I think the biggest thing for Ottawa, and it kind of looked like it was going this way again this year, is it's been a goalie graveyard for a long time, right? It's just been, their goaltending has been no good, to be honest. I mean, they were 30th in the league in save percentage last year. They bring in Linus Ullmark. They make that deal with Boston. He comes in, looks great. He gets hurt in training camp. Now he's hurt again. And yet, they got Levi Merrilainen comes up from the American League. They got him with a 3rd round pick. He looks like a real player. They're cobbling it together with Ullmark out of the lineup. They're getting way better performance from Thomas Chabot than they got last year. Jake Sanderson looks like a star. What's really intriguing about Ottawa is they have a core of American players that really like it there. Tkachuk, Norris, Pinto, Sanderson, missing some other guys, but they've got a bunch of American guys that like it. And that's a big thing in Canada.
Let's, Gord, go to our hometown and suck all the oxygen out of the room with our beloved Toronto Maple Leafs. We've got, I don't even know where to start with them, other than I'm going to just start by saying that I think insanity prevails there like it does in a lot of markets. It's all about expectation. You hit the nail on the head. And in Toronto, the expectation is if you don't win in the playoffs, somebody's head has to be on a pole at the end of it. Last year, a coach that had coached really well that lost in overtime in Game 7 gets fired. This year, I've said all year, and I like this guy, and I think he's done a tremendous job in Toronto. But Brendan Shanahan, if they go out in the first round, people will be calling for his head, right? Even though he doesn't make the hockey decisions. So will the insanity ever stop in Toronto to let them compete the way they should compete properly?
Well, I'm in New York today. Will the insanity ever stop here around the pro sports teams? No.
Well, it only did 1 year.
I think the thing in Toronto that's interesting is that there's all the talk about the pressure and the scrutiny. It's true, there's lots of scrutiny, but it's not like the players get grazed on for half an hour after a game. They bring them out, they do their 5 minutes, and they leave. Like, the players are very protected. The weird thing about the Leafs is that in the Matthews era, so since they drafted Auston Matthews, they have been one of the NHL's highest scoring teams. They score a lot. And they haven't in the playoffs. For all the talk about the Leafs, not being good enough on defense, not being good enough in goal, the problem is they haven't scored in the playoffs. Right? They scored 2 or fewer, I think it was like 15 out of their last 16 playoff games, or a stretch of 15 out of 16 playoff games. They scored 2 or fewer goals. It just doesn't compute. And the problem with it is it becomes the narrative. Even though they had, it's not Auston Matthews' fault that the Leafs haven't been to the Stanley Cup final since 1967. Right? It's not, but it becomes part of your narrative. It's like the Buffalo Sabres. They haven't made the playoffs in 13 straight years. None of those players have been there for that entire 13 years. But as soon as you put on that uniform, you got to wear that. That becomes part of you. It becomes part of your identity, even though you weren't part of it. Right? So you get, so Anthony Stolarz signs the Leafs. He puts on it. All of a sudden, he's part of the Leafs playoff narrative. You've never played a playoff game for them yet. So that's the difficult part is trying to undo that. They have been so close so many times. I don't buy this narrative that they're bad playoff players. I don't believe that. I don't think they, I don't think they don't try as hard. I don't think they changed their game. I think they brought Craig Berube in to change their game, to be more of a straight line, try to grind it out, win low scoring games. And there are times when it does look like a square peg in a round hole. But again, as I said earlier, the other night on Thursday night, Auston Matthews and William Nylander took that game over with their skill. Like, there's just, I was watching Toronto Montreal on Saturday night. Montreal up 3-0. And all of a sudden, Toronto just comes back and their skill just takes it over. Like, when you could argue that in that game, Toronto had the 3 best players. If you're doing a draft of all the players that played in that game, Matthews would be the first pick. Nylander's probably second. Marner might be third, right? Like, when you have that, you always have a chance, I think. There's been a major philosophical shift in Toronto. They have gone from the Kyle Dubas era, where they had smaller puck-moving players, especially on defense. So out go Rasmus Sandin, out go Timothy Liljegren, in come, Chris Tanev, Ekman Larson, larger, more stay-at-home. I mean, Ekman Larson at this point in his career is more of a stay-at-home guy. So they're bigger, they're heavier, they're playing more of a straight-line game. Again, you talk about the playoff format, Neil. Like, I think the key for them is to finish first in the Atlantic. Because, right now they play Columbus in the first round. Sorry, they would play Ottawa in the first round. My apologies. But if you get into that soup of finishing second or third, now you're into Florida, Tampa, right? Like,
and they have
tough.
a real disadvantage with that baggage that they have sitting all over their locker room, and the baggage from 1967. It's a lot of bags.
I think more, but it's more to the point though. 2019, 21. It's funny because in a lot of the playoff series they've lost, they did not have home ice advantage. They would not have been the favorites, but there are a couple where they were. They lost to Columbus in that play-in round game, whatever you want to call that, play in the bubble. They lost. They blew the 3-1 lead to Montreal. But in a lot of cases in these playoff losses, they have not been the favorite. So it hasn't been these epic collapses, but there have been collapses within those series. And the fact that but you touched on something really important, that someone has to be to blame, right? So fans were squawking all summer about trading Mitch Marner. I'd go to the grocery store in Toronto, go to the gas station, out for a walk and be like, when are they going to trade Marner? And getting rid of good players is not a good way to build a hockey team. Neil, I know you're the former manager and you're the expert on this, but as a layman, giving away good players is not a good way to build a hockey team.
No, you can look at an era in the Edmonton Oilers and see that. There was an era where they started giving away first overall players, and it's no way to succeed.
No, and so Marner's a really good player, and Nylander's a really good player. And he drives them nuts sometimes. I thought Nylander was great before the game on Thursday. They've lost 3 in a row in regulation for the first time and this year, and it's 3 losses. What's the big deal? And he goes out and scores 2 goals, including the overtime winner. Like you do have, if you're gonna say it like that, you got to back it up. But I would say this, and we mentioned him before, Alex Kovalev. People thought Alex didn't care. Now you can speak to it better than I can. He did. I always got the sense he did. He just didn't show it like other people. And that's Nylander. He doesn't smash his stick. He doesn't bark at people. He just has a different personality. He cared. You couldn't get to this level unless you did. You couldn't do all that's required to get to this level unless you cared. He just doesn't show it like everyone else does.
Absolutely right. And that's the same. It can be the same with anybody. Roger Nielsen used to get that rap on him that he wasn't emotional enough behind the bench, and yet he was one of the greatest coaches. He's in the Hockey Hall of Fame. Go ahead, Vic.
2 crystal ball questions for you, Gord.
Oh, God.
Well, do both Marner and Tavares wear the Maple Leaf jersey next year? That's question 1.
So I'm going to take the coward's way out and say it depends what happened in the playoffs. I think they bring Tavares back. I think he's been very good for them. They miss him out of the lineup. He'll come back at a lower number. He likes it there. They like him. But if they face plant in the playoffs again, there will be changes. No question. You can't keep rolling this out if they don't get past, at least, get past the first or second round.
Well, there's certainly something that maybe the fortunes are changing in Toronto. Phenomenal stat that we heard on Saturday, that the Maple Leafs have played 387 times in Montreal going back to 1917, and that was the first time that they'd ever come back from down 3 goals in Montreal. So maybe things are improving a little bit there.
I was shocked to hear that. I mean, that's stunning that that's never happened in all those years. And Montreal fans would point out, some leads that got away from the Leafs in Montreal. They're a really good team. They've been a very good team for a long time. Since Matthews got there, they've been a very good team. They have not succeeded in the playoffs for a variety of reasons. And I think one of the hardest things for management to do is to sit down and decide why it didn't go your way. And I remember talking to Doug Armstrong when he was in Dallas and they missed the playoffs one year. And he said, I don't think we're a bad team. I think we had a bad year. Now, that's probably the easier way to look at it. But he was right. And the next year, they were right back and went to the conference final. I think that with the Leafs, if they don't succeed in the playoffs this year, there likely will be big changes. But sometimes that doesn't work. They have really good players. I think one of the problems they've had is their top players take up such a big part of their payroll. They don't have a lot of depth. They don't have a lot of, their third and fourth lines don't give them much. They don't get a lot from their defense. They have not had Morgan Rielly had 20 goals, 4 years ago, but they're last in the league in goals by defensemen. They've had a series of goalies go through there on kind of bargain contracts. So I think that's been one issue. The cap going up will help them, will alleviate some of that pressure. But ultimately, they're going to succeed if their big guys succeed. They're going to win because Matthews, Marner, Nylander, Tavares are exceptional in the playoffs. That's how they'll win.
You've taken us across the continent over last 55 minutes or so. So the golden question here, I don't think all 7 Canadian teams can get in. What do you see? 4, 5, or 6?
6.
So that would mean that both Montreal and Ottawa are getting in, and either Calgary or Vancouver.
Maybe I'll go 5 then, if you put it that way. No, I think high side 6. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a great question, and that
But if I knew, I always tell people, if I knew for sure who was winning hockey games, I'd live in a mansion in Las Vegas.
Yeah, wouldn't we all?
Gord, I got to just tell you, the great thing about this, though, and we talked about Edmonton and Vancouver, we talked about Boston and Ottawa, we talked about the Rangers and Canadiens. These games were played at such a phenomenal pace and intensity just past the midway point of the season. And I was talking with Neil earlier that it just harkens back. You remember the days of the old Adams division that they played about 60 games of their season just trying to decide position, and it was a slog. And just to see how these games are being played right now with this intensity, this much hope, this much energy, it's only good for the NHL.
I think the biggest difference we're seeing is that the teams at the bottom are getting better. So you're not going to roll up in your 5 games against, bottom level teams. Like Ottawa's better, Detroit's better, Montreal's better, Buffalo's a little better, right? So you don't have teams under 350 winning percentage, right? So it gets tighter and the games become more important. Like, look at the standings. It's crazy. And I look at the last 10 games, everyone's like 5-4, 5-4-1, 6-3-1. They're all packed together. I think it's great. Now, it's a bit artificial because the standings, there's some games were 3 points, some were 2. But the fact is that, you've got Ottawa going into Jersey on Sunday and talking about a crucial game it is. On January the 19th. Talk about a crucial game. And then, the game against the Rangers is a big game for those teams tomorrow night. And it really underlines, and I'm sorry I've taken up so much of your time, but I will, think back to the 80s and Pittsburgh once went 17 straight years without winning in Philadelphia. They were in the same division the entire time. They went from 1972 to 1989 without winning in Philadelphia. Vancouver went 27 in a row without winning in Edmonton. That doesn't happen anymore. It was a 16 team, it was a 21 team league where 16 made the playoffs. And we used to joke that the bad teams, it was like Batman. The bad teams were like the villains. They were easily picked out of a crowd. Everyone knew who they were. You fattened up on them and then you sorted out in the playoffs. It's not like that anymore. And I think that it's great for fans in all the markets. And it's a grind for the players. There's no nights off. It is a night in, night out grind. And all of a sudden you lose 3 in a row. You talk to teams that go on a winning streak. You win 6 in a row and you gain 2 points in the standings. You lose 3 in a row and you drop 4 points in the standings. Like it's tough. And I think, Vic, to your point, it's great. Like like I'll be watching games tonight. You can't take your eyes off it. I'm excited about, look, Ottawa and Boston are going to play again on Thursday night. I can't wait. Like that was a great regular season game on Saturday. And I'm sure Thursday will be the same thing.
Gord, you're right on the money. And one mistake by management, little mistake, and we've talked about a couple of them in Vancouver. That's a mistake when you let things get public. I don't care. That's up to management to shut that down and don't let it get out there. Jacob Trouba in New York, that was up to management to not let that get out there. That got out. Look at their season. The Swayman thing in Boston became a public thing. The Vancouver thing becomes when you let things get public, no good can come of it. And I think all these things you've hit on have been tremendous for us and, of course, the listeners. And it's really been fun. I mean, I know I could go on for another hour, and we don't want to keep you because we want you to say, oh, yeah, I don't mind going on their show. But in all fairness, I mean, this was terrific. I've learned a lot just listening to you about these teams. We don't get to see them as much. I want to say before we go, Vic and Gord, we've talked a lot about the bubble teams. And by bubble, I mean Canadiens, Senators, Flames. But one team I want to mention that's not a Canadian team, but I'm going to see them tonight. I couldn't be more happy for, and that is the Columbus Blue Jackets. And the fact of what they've been through since the summer with Johnny and Matthew Gaudreau, and the fact that they handled that so fantastically, if you can. I mean, it's such a horrible situation. And their players seem to have rallied around this, I guess. I'm not in the locker room. And they're having a tremendous season, again, based on expectations. They're having a tremendous season. Sean Monahan, the best friend of Johnny Gaudreau, is having a breakout season at this point in his career. And I just want to mention that because it's such a heartbreaking and heartwarming story about the Columbus Blue Jackets.
I think they are the biggest story in the NHL this year. I really believe that. I think that I was there for their second game of the year, and, the shadow that was hanging over them, Monahan bought a house a few doors down from Johnny Gaudreau's house. They're best friends. But the way Monahan carried himself, the Blue Jackets told me that, at the start of the year, they're having their media day, and they told Monahan, you don't have to do it. Like, you don't have to answer all this. No, I'll do it. And he has been his character, I don't want to say strength, but just his courage has been unbelievable. Zach Werenski looks like a star. He's been hurt the last couple of years. He's a star, right? Like, he'll be in the Norris Trophy conversation. He's probably the front runner right now for it. He's been unbelievable. They're getting, the two Russians, Voronkov and Marchenko are scoring for them. Like, and Dean Evison is doing it. I mean, imagine taking that job and then having to navigate through this.
Oh, Don Waddell as well. Don Waddell just got,
and Don's been through, and look, I mean, the tragic loss of those guys and the way they've embraced the families, it's an astonishing thing. And it is, I watch them. The amazing thing about them is they play hard every night. Like, they don't have nights off. Like, when you talk to coaches around the league and players, like, they are a handful every night. They don't win every night, but they don't leave much on the ice. Like, they give it all. And I just think it is, to me, the most astonishing story in the league this year.
One quick thing about the Columbus Blue Jackets. I want to just say this to you, Gord. 2 years ago, when Ty's son, Max, was playing for Columbus, some clients asked me if I would sit behind the bench with them. And it was like 3 rows up from the Columbus bench. And I watched intently what goes on the bench because, you used to be a player, and I liked to. Nobody talked to anybody. Nobody said a word. I swear to you, no one said a word to anyone. They'd come off for the TV timeout. No conversations, no rallying, no let's go boys, no all the stuff that you think should be on the bench. Nothing. And I mean nothing. And so I came out of that saying, God, no wonder why these guys are always so bad. Like they're not even a team. They just go out individually. And now turn it around 2 years later. I'm going to be there tonight to see them play the Islanders again. I can't wait to see their bench tonight because I'll guarantee you it won't be like that bench 2 years ago.
Yeah, I'll watch for that. And I think you're right. I think what happens when teams are struggling is, and even bigger than that, guys, when organizations are struggling, when there's hard times, the easiest thing is to draw back in yourself, right? Is to go inward and say, okay, like I'm okay, or I'm doing my job, or it's not my fault, right? Like I'm not really part of this. I'm just in here. And the hardest thing to do is to put your hand on the table and say, I want to be part of I got to be better. We all have to be better. It's one thing to say it. It's another to do it. And I think that I don't know if the tragedy played into that. I can't speak to that, but I can say they are a very, very tight group. They are guys who play for each other and clearly care for each other. Like you watch the way they celebrate goals. You watch when a guy gets his first goal. You watch, like, they are clearly playing for each other. And that sounds like a cliche, but it's very true. When you play for the guys next to you and not for yourself, that's a very powerful thing.
You're not kidding. Amen. Gord, thanks so much for coming on here, and have fun tonight in the big city. You got a day off in New York City, so that should be fun. And you do great work. Vic and I watch you all the time, and you've always done great work. That's nothing new. So we appreciate your knowledge, and the time you've taken with us has been amazing. Thanks so much.
My pleasure, guys.
Thank you, Gord. Neil, listening to Gord Miller is like hearing an encyclopedia of hockey in Canada.
Well, Gord does a lot of play-by-play there, and rightfully so for TSN. And TSN is the, if you don't mind the expression, the ESPN of Canada. And Gord does a lot of games there and does them very well. And of course, you're in the hockey hotbed when you live in Toronto, where Gord lives. And just a great guy, though. That's the most important thing. And Gord Miller is a really good person and spent a lot of time with us. We never expected to get that much time.
It was certainly terrific. And this episode, along with all of our others, are available on our website, NHLWraparound.com. We will have New York Centric coming up on Tuesday, and then short shifts on Wednesday and Friday of this week. So a few other items to chat about. A little update on Ryan McLeod's awarded goal January 15th against the Carolina Hurricanes, when he had an open net for his third goal of the game. His stick was chopped out of his hands by Brent Burns. He did not actually touch the puck, but I gave Dave Jackson a call, and he did clarify that even though McLeod was not the last player to touch the puck, the goal is awarded to the player that is denied the scoring opportunity. And now McLeod is on IR. He took a fall in practice last Thursday. So a little bit of bittersweet news for Ryan McLeod. Speaking of fouls, Maxim Siplikov was suspended for 3 games for the hit to the head of Rylan Paling of the Flyers last Thursday. He can return Saturday against Carolina. And this was a suspension you'd been calling for, Neil.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't know if I would say I was calling for it. What I was saying was that it was definitely a hit to the head. It was definitely a dangerous hit. It should have been a penalty. At the time, the referees decided that it was not a penalty, but that did not stop player safety, who is not in touch with referees. They're not part of the refereeing system. They took a look at it and deemed that it was an illegal hit to the head. And yes, he did get a suspension.
You want a little bit more ornery?
Sure.
All right, we'll give it to you. The Wild have already been ticked off that Connor McDavid was not suspended for the elbow against Marcus Johansson, And they also had a score to settle when they played Nashville on Saturday night, because this was the first meeting since Zach LaRue slew-footed their captain, Jared Spurgeon, on December 31st. Spurgeon has not played since. And so Jakob Trenin engaged LaRue in a fight less than 2 minutes in. And then 2 seconds after that, Marcus Foligno and Luke Schenn fought for the 6th time in their career. And their brothers, Nick Foligno and Braden Schenn, fought in the Winter Classic. So I would say if ever there is a dinner meeting that I would want to go to, it would be with those 4 brothers.
Yes, the Schenns and the Folignos. And boy, they're what makes hockey great, though, aren't they? The way they play the game.
Tremendous. Couple of player notes. In the Penguins' 5-2 win against Buffalo, Alex Nedeljkovic became perhaps the best 200-foot player in the NHL with an empty net goal, an assist on the eventual game-winning goal, and 40 saves. He became the first goalie in NHL history with a goal and an assist in the same game, the only goalie to score in the NHL, AHL, and ECHL. He scored 2 in the A with Charlotte and Wilkes-Barre. Second goalie this season to score, Philip Gustafson of the Wild against St. Louis on October 15th. This was the 12th time and 19th overall. Well, actually, the 12th time that that the puck was actually shot into the empty net. 19 times a goalie has been credited overall. And the Pens now have a 2-season scoring streak with their goalies putting pucks in the net. Tristan Jarry, who just cleared waivers and was sent down to the minors, did it November 30th of last year against Tampa Bay. So quite a milestone there for Nedeljkovic. And also Cale Makar became the 5th fastest defenseman to score 100 goals. He did it in 362 games. And pretty good company there, Neil. Bobby Orr, Paul Coffey, Ray Bork, Dennis Potvin.
And Cale Makar is today's version of those 4 Hall of Famers. He is that good. And so congratulations to Cale Makar, who I love to watch, by the way. Just love watching him. To have him and McKinnon on the same team is pretty awesome for Colorado.
When we spoke with Gord about Lane Hutson, do you see a little bit of Makar in Hudson's game?
Well, I do. And I'm really astonished at Hudson and the way he is poised at his age and the way he plays, and he goes into all the dangerous areas with that puck, and meaning goes down the boards while a 6'5" guy is trying to kill him and things. Boy, oh boy, I think that Hudson is going to be a great player for the Montreal Canadiens for a long time.
This is the human side of the story, and 67 years ago, Saturday evening, January 18th of 1958, Willie O'Ree broke the color barrier in the NHL, playing for the Boston Bruins in his very first game against the Montreal Canadiens. And Neil, Willie O'Ree has been a gentleman that you have had many interactions with over the years, and quite the gentleman and ambassador for hockey.
A great ambassador for hockey and the National Hockey League, and is a gentleman, all those things you just said, with a great, interesting life story that deserves recognition. He was born in October of 1935, which means this coming October, he'll be 90 years of age and still in great shape. He's the youngest of 9 siblings, born in Fredericton, New Brunswick in Canada, of course. How did he end up in Canada, or how did his family end up in Canada? His grandparents escaped slavery in the United States by taking the Underground Railroad and getting into Canada. When he was growing up, his family was one of only 2 Black families in Fredericton, New Brunswick. began skating at the age of 3 and started playing organized hockey when he was 5. He had a brother that taught him how to do body checking. And he played in junior hockey in the Quebec League for several different teams and in Ontario, and then joined the Quebec Aces when they were in the Quebec Hockey League in 1955. Willie O'Ree was called up to the Boston Bruins to replace Leo Labine, who was unable to play due to illness. And Willie O'Ree, 2 years earlier, and a lot of people don't know this, was hit in the eye with a puck and was legally blind in one eye. If the Boston Bruins had known that, he wouldn't have been able to play for Boston, but he didn't tell anybody. He played with only vision in one eye, and that's quite a story to think of. That added on to the fact that he broke the color barrier. So played for the Boston Bruins and now has his number 22 retired by those Boston Bruins. And as we said, the best thing you can say about Willie O'Ree is what a wonderful human being that he is.
I've met him on, I believe, 1 or 2 occasions, and gracious, kind, and I know you probably felt the same way when you've met him.
Oh, yes. And always, and it's humbling to meet him because you think about what he represents, and he represents the fact that he was the first person of color to play in the National Hockey League is quite a big deal. I mean, it's Jackie Robinson was the first guy in baseball. We all know that. And baseball probably had a lot more qualified players of color to play in Major League Baseball than hockey had at the time. But there were a number of players of color that were good enough to play in the league, but teams just didn't bring them up. So Willie O'Ree did come up, and he trailblazed for generations to come.
And just a footnote on another trailblazer, the San Jose Sharks play in Boston on Monday. Mike Greer, the Sharks GM, the first general manager that is black in NHL history. Before we leave, we had such a great conversation today with Gord Miller, and we want to recognize a couple of talent that are going through some health issues. John Giannone, MSG host for the New York Rangers, also reports from between the benches during their games, was diagnosed with prostate cancer in December and revealed that diagnosis a couple of weeks back during the pregame show. He is still working with the Rangers, and we certainly wish him well. And a friend of the show, Neil, Craig Laughlin, will undergo heart surgery at the end of this month. He worked his last game on Saturday when the Capitals beat the Pittsburgh Penguins, and we certainly wish him well as well.
Certainly. I know Craig. I know his whole family, and I know he'll get through this with flying colors because he's a very strong individual.
With that, we close our show today. Thanks to TSN's Gord Miller for giving so much of his time to us this afternoon and spreading just a wealth of knowledge. Thanks to UBS Financial Services, Inc., NHL Wraparound, and UBS Financial Services, Inc. are not affiliated. UBS is a sponsor of 3 Things You Need to Pay Attention To. No other affiliation, relationship, or endorsement is made, suggested, intended, or should be implied or inferred between UBS and VNS Productions, LLC, or any of the individuals or businesses and or their respective products and services appearing in this program. We thank our listeners. Send questions or comments to nhlwraparound@gmail.com. All of our shows are on all podcast platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Amazon, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and YouTube. So please subscribe, like us, and also check out some of our shorter clips on X at NHL Wraparound. Neil, before we sign off for today, any final words?
No, I think I've used all of mine. I think I'm out of words, and that's hard for me to be out of words.
think this is one of our longest shows ever, so hope you enjoyed. And please join us on Tuesday for New York Centric and short shifts coming up on Wednesday and Friday. Take care, all.
Thanks for joining us on the NHL Wraparound podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date on all the NHL action.